The Biden agenda is dead or dying, and the Democrats are beside themselves, livid with Joe Manchin because of it. The Democrats have a 50-50 Senate. The filibuster requires a 60 vote threshold. Joe Manchin says he's not going to get rid of the filibuster. He's not even going to reform it. There is a full court press on by members of the press, not just Democrats, members of the press, to lower the threshold to 55. That's not going to happen. Manchin's not going to do it. So the Democrats can't get anything done. Infrastructure is going to have to be bipartisan. There are backroom deals being made by Republican and Democrats in the Senate. They've got the outline and framework of a deal. They just don't have an actual deal to show for it. The pay equity legislation is dead. HR 1S1, the voting rights bill is dead. The John Lewis voting rights bill is dead. Filibuster reform is dead. The Democratic agenda cannot get done. And on top of that, there is a crime wave in the nation that is hurting the Democrats. It is impacting how the Democrats are proceeding, and it's making it impossible for them to get anything done. So, for example, the Democrats in Washington, D.C. very much want to prohibit some of the Republican election reform measures at the state level. They want to, for example, require that there be no more gerrymandering, that bipartisan or nonpartisan commissions draw the lines to protect the House Democrats. They think it would help them. It really wouldn't. All the data shows that if you drew nonpartisan lines, it would still benefit Republicans because most states, rural states in particular, you're able to draw lines more conveniently for the Republicans. And in California and Maryland and Illinois, you would have to draw seats that benefit Republicans, where Democrats are engaged in gerrymandering without the media willing to acknowledge it. Likewise, you have a problem with the crime issue. The Republicans are able to make hay out of this issue because prominent Democratic voices are still out there saying that the governments need to defund the police. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the squad, the so-called squad, continue to push defund the police language. It's not helpful for Democrats around the country as the crime wave goes up. Joe Biden is president and the Democrats are in charge of Congress, so they get the blame. The Republicans don't have to work with them. Republicans get credit from their base by obstructing it, and voters don't blame them for obstruction because they're thinking the Democrats can do everything. Well, why can't Joe Biden just do executive orders? Well, he really can, and the public doesn't understand that. There's not a nuanced conversation in that regard. So now infrastructure is going to require that the Democrats have a bipartisan deal with the GOP, but that infrastructure negotiation and deal that they're going to have with the GOP will abandon parts of the Green New Deal, while the Democrats have tried to create a fierce urgency of now on the part of the public to deal with it. Here's the problem for the Democrats. More and more voters now recognize that climate change is an issue. Whether you or I do, a majority of Americans now believe climate change is a problem. And they want the government to do something about climate change. But concurrent to that, when you poll Americans about the individual solutions to climate change, they're pretty much opposed to all of the Democrats' preferred policies. So, for example, forcing people to give up gas-guzzling cars. The public supports it, except their car. They don't want to give up their car. Having the government fund battery infrastructure around the country. The public supports it until they're told their taxes would go up to support it. Having buildings shut down and renovated through the Green New Deal, the public doesn't actually like that, nor do they want it with their homes. In swing states, they're heavy coal infrastructure and carbon infrastructure, and those people don't want to give up their jobs for the Green New Deal. Having taxes go up, the public's opposed to it. Getting rid of cows, the public's opposed to it. Forcing people to become vegetarians or eat those synthetic processed hemoglobin fake meat substitutes, the public's opposed to it. Having power rate increases, the public's opposed to it. And then there's a recognition on the part of the public that China, India, Brazil, Russia, some of these third and second world countries that are fast growing, they're more to blame than us. And the public doesn't seem to understand why we must give up our way of life when we're really not the culprit anymore. It's those countries. Why are we always to blame when really it's those countries? And Americans understand that. So the Democrats have very, very difficult needles to thread when the public kind of gets the parameters. The public supports them overall on an issue, but in general, but the more they learn about it, they don't. And then the Democrats themselves are suffering from a fundamental problem I want to spend a little more time with later, but you need to understand right now. The Democrats now have a rise of polling firms that are given credibility by the media, but themselves aren't really credible. So, for example, there is a data group, Data Progress is a left-wing polling firm that shows 75% of Republican voters in West Virginia support the Democrats' voting rights bill. Do you really believe that's the truth? Do you really believe that 75% of Republicans support a Democratic voting measure in the United States House of Representatives that even most Democrats don't even understand? If you think that's true, I've got a bridge to sell you. It's not true, and yet the Democrats are being taken over by grifters, pushing polls that tell them what they want to hear, and the New York Times is advancing those polls as if they're legitimate. Very much like back in the day, you had PPP, the Democratic polling firm, would produce all of these polls showing overwhelming public support for gay marriage, and then you would go to the polls and gay marriage would always lose. The Democrats believe the polls and then delegitimize the actual electoral results because it conflicted with the polling. It's something Republicans have done to some degree, but the Democrats are now escalating it, and they can't get their agenda done. There's no willingness to acknowledge that reality in polling deviates. I myself, it took me a long time to get to the point of thinking we really can't trust the polls anymore. But where the polls and our intuition align, we probably should. The problem is that Democrats now live in more of a bubble than Republicans. I and you are more likely to encounter someone on the other side of the aisle than they are us. Democrats are more likely to live in bubbles. Democrats are more likely to live in Democratic enclaves. Democrats are more likely to affirm their worldview by a left-leaning press. They are never challenged on their thoughts and their policies. They're never challenged on what they believe is true. They're never challenged by the media because the media is in the bubble with them. And the result is that they are losing touch with the American public. They are losing touch with American values, and they are losing touch with public policy positions that sell. But at the same time, they're in charge of Washington, D.C. So they're in charge of the Senate, they're in charge of the House, they're in charge of the White House, they're in charge of the bureaucracy, and they can't get anything done. And so they have become deeply, deeply frustrated. But their frustration is manifesting itself in ways that will frustrate them further. They are more frustrated with internal Democrats than they are the Republicans right now. So, for example, Democrats are turning on Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, two Democrats who, if they were defeated tomorrow, or if they died tomorrow, their Republican governors would pick Republican replacements and the Republicans would take back the Senate. If they were defeated tomorrow, the Republicans would more likely than not win and take back the Senate. If Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema converted to the GOP, Mitch McConnell would become the majority leader. The Democrats don't have a lot of options. It is the middle of June, 2021. In October, the new fiscal year will start. And the Democrats will start focusing on next year's midterms. The result is going to be deep dissatisfaction and frustration within the Democratic Party towards Democrats who have blocked Joe Biden's initiatives. It'll be a deeper frustration for Democrats against Democrats than Republicans because it's the Democrats who control the Senate. They've convinced themselves, by faith, they've convinced themselves that the filibuster is worth getting rid of. They're not paying attention to the long game. They're paying attention to the short game. Meanwhile, you've got Joe Manchin saying it would destroy the Senate. I'm not going to do it. He's a Democrat. They want to beat him as a result of it. They can't beat him. He's not up for re-election, which means they can't do anything. The level of frustration that's setting in on the Democratic Party right now doesn't end well for the Democrats. It will spark a Democratic civil war because it's the Democrats obstructing the Democrats. The Republicans can't obstruct. It's Joe Manchin who could help them get rid of the filibuster, and he's not going to do it. And even if they were to lower the threshold to 55, Mitch McConnell has got the Republicans towing a line. They still wouldn't be able to get this stuff through. No Republican supports the Voting Rights Act that the Democrats have passed. They're out of options, and they're running out of time. About the only thing Joe Biden can do is bold foreign policy initiatives that he doesn't need Congress to be a part of. And even he's having trouble getting that done because some of his allies are still deeply skeptical of this country because they know, Donald Trump could come back in a couple of years. So why bother negotiating with Joe Biden?